I work in Norway. Every single time I'm invited to present anywhere, we have the same NGO financed by the Americans, National Endowment for Democracy, that cancels, that tries to make them pull back my invitation. If I'm interviewed by the media, they're pressuring the media to apologize. They're posting pictures of my house on social media. They're trying to invoke threats from different digital online trolls.
This was Professor Glenn Diesen. Back in late 2021, long before the first Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, Professor Glenn Diesen made a prediction that most experts either dismissed or refused to acknowledge. War was inevitable. Not because Russia wanted war, but because NATO had been escalating, pushing further and further, ignoring every diplomatic off-ramp. Then in November 2023, when I interviewed Glenn the first time, it was already clear to him that Russia will win this war. Fast forward, and here we are, watching a war unravel that could have been and should have been avoided, but wasn't. But let's be honest, the way this war is being discussed in the West, it's not about reality. It's about perception management. People aren't just being informed, they are being led to conclusions. And that's exactly what we are unpacking today. Because while most attention is fixed on troop movements and weapon shipments, the bigger battle is happening in our minds, in your minds. The war in Ukraine has been a textbook case of propaganda in action, and that's exactly what Glenn Diesen has been exposing in his work. Now let's talk about the manufacturing of consent. You may remember Noam Chomsky, a concept that has been around for decades but never felt more relevant. The media doesn't force you to think a certain way, it just shapes the boundaries of what's acceptable to believe. Take strategic messaging. Carefully crafted language repeated endlessly to make sure the public reaches the right conclusions. That's why we keep hearing that Ukraine is a fight for democracy, while Russia is the aggressor who, completely unprovoked, has invaded its neighbor. And that's also why anyone who questions the mainstream narrative or NATO's role is labeled a Putin apologist or Putin Versteher. It's not news, it's narrative control. And the scary part, it really works. This brings us to a question most people aren't asking. Why is the West, and especially Europe, now that the US is pulling back, so determined to drag this war out instead of pushing for peace? Wars end when there's a political solution. But until most recently, there's been no real effort for negotiations. Only more weapons, more escalation, more proxy war rhetoric. Why? Because for some, a long war is good for business. It justifies military spending. It weakens Russia without a single NATO or US soldier dying. And it keeps the European public distracted from the economic mess their own leaders created. And if you don't buy into this official narrative, if you dare to question it, well, good luck staying online. As you will see in a moment, my own Twitter account has been suspended, but that's not an exception. Dissenting voices are being wiped out, shadow banned, deplatformed, blacklisted. Academics, journalists, even former military officials are finding themselves erased from public discourse. Why? Because you can't control a population if they're allowed to think for themselves. So that's exactly what we are talking about today. Glenn has been warning about all of this for years. And whether you agree with him or not, you can't ignore the facts. This war isn't just being fought on the battlefield. It's being fought in the information space, in our media, and in our minds. In my latest expose, I argue that Ukraine was a brilliant trap for Russia. If you don't believe me, hear me out. The link is in the description below. One last thing. Critical voices, like the ones you hear on this channel, are being actively silenced, shadow banned, and deplatformed. Not in theory, not in some distant future, right now. You might not see it, you might not believe it, but I have the numbers and viewer feedback, like the ones you see now on your screen, to prove it. And I know it now from first-hand experience because my own Twitter account has been permanently suspended. Not for breaking any rules, not for spam, not for bots, but for challenging the wrong narratives and questioning the wrong interests. That's how this game is played today. Step outside the script and they shut you down. Not with a debate, not with facts, but with silence. So if you value sharp, unfiltered analysis, the kind that doesn't play by mainstream rules, do something about it. Subscribe, like and share this video. Every click makes it harder for them to erase these conversations. And if you really want to keep up with my work without censorship, join me on Substack. No algorithmic choke holes, no hidden filters, just raw, honest analysis. You can also find my podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Amazon. All the links are right below. Think about it. If we don't support independent voices, soon there won't be any left. Professor Glenn Diesen, what a pleasure having you again. How are you?
Hi, good to see you.
I just checked. We had a previous conversation about 1.5 years ago, and based on our discussion then, I titled the interview "Russia Will Win the War." Now here we are.
Yeah, no, I think it's well, it was predictable, and I think it should have been predictable to everyone who are following the metrics on the ground. I think the main problem is we've been swept away with propaganda. Indeed, I noticed this as well. I said Russia will win this war. Indeed, especially by the summer of 2023, it was very obvious that the war was over. But of course, we have been pushing for a long war across the West, and we only embrace narratives which support the long war. So if you're arguing that the war is being lost, then the argument you're met with arguments that you're being pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian, because the assumption is you're undermining trust and support for the war by challenging the narrative. And so reality often doesn't mean that much anymore. And I noticed the same with the sanctions, by the way. I said from the very first day, this won't work because this is something that I've been working on myself over the past decade, which is Russia's economic reorganization of its economy from west to the east. So it was quite evident that they would be able to diversify and withstand these sanctions. Although I thought they would have to absorb more pain than they actually did. But nonetheless, I was also told, well, if you argue that the sanctions aren't working, that means that's what the Kremlin is saying. NATO is saying that it is working. So now you're taking the side of Russia. So again, you're a traitor. So nobody wants to hear about the arguments. They don't want to hear about the metrics. They don't want to have any of discussions. They just want this obedience to the narrative. And it's very, very frustrating, especially for an academic to operate in such an environment where everything is just narrative driven.
Yeah, in German they call it Putin-Versteher, yeah, someone who understands Putin if you bring any arguments that go against the mainstream media.
Yeah, this is probably the dumbest of
Yeah,
all expression that this
yeah,
is a derogatory term to understand your
yeah,
opponent. I mean, from my
yeah,
perspective, this is one of the greatest weaknesses in the West now, this idea that we're not allowed to discuss the concerns of others. We're not allowed to understand them. This is really a huge problem, and it will bring us great pain, I think, in the future.
yeah. I would like to make this interview about propaganda, and in a moment I will explain why. But before we do, we cannot disregard what's going on right now with the so-called peace deal. Yeah. So I checked all the news media this morning first thing to see if there was any response already from Russia. There is none. However, there was an interview with Lavrov yesterday, brand new, where he kind of already cautioned the expectations. The peace deal, a one-sided deal between, let's say, the US. The one thing, and this is what I want to point at and come back to you. For me, and also from our discussions already, the same Jeffrey Sachs, when I interviewed him almost 2 years ago, it was clear that America was the driver, the initiator, and the propagator of this war. Yeah. Even if we go only back to 2014, Kiev, Maidan, we know the leaked telephone tapes from Victoria Nuland, fuck the EU, pardon my French, etc. Now, today we have the same entity, the US, who kind of, how shall I say this? I'm polite, yeah, initiated or sponsored, sowieso sponsored. Um, I don't want to really say started the war, but really drove the war from the outset. Now we have this very entity kind of presenting itself as a peace negotiator. So is that not the world upside down?
It's very absurd. And well, again, I noticed that, yeah, well, if it's everything is narrative. If you want to dump the war on the Europeans, then you portray it as a European war and America as simply on the sidelines. Now, Trump tried to rhetorically shifted by suggesting that Biden started this war by pushing NATO expansion, and we all knew how that would end. But still, everyone wants to wash their hands with this, and it's also worth noting that back in 2022 when this began, it was the German retired general Harald Kujat who came out with warnings that not only did he make the argument that the NATO had provoked this war and the Americans and British had sabotaged all paths to peace, and especially then the Istanbul negotiations by pressuring the Ukrainians to walk away from it. But he also warned that Germany was setting itself up as a target, as in a very well, now in a proxy war, very much closely bordering to direct war. And at some point, the Americans could simply pull back and say, well, this is not our problem, and Germany would be left all to its own, facing Russia. So it should be careful not to be led into this war against Russia. And here we are 3 years later, and I think he was very much spot on. And yeah, the Americans are seeing the war has been lost. This is why Trump is trying to pull out of this. It's not a peacemaker necessarily. Well, I'm very glad he's pushing a peace, but the war has been lost. So America wants to wash its hands with it, dump it on the Europeans. The Europeans seem to be overexcited about taking over, and yeah, but and now they're left with this. So it's a strategic move by the Americans, and of course, then you have to construct a narrative around it, which makes it all make a lot of sense. So this is a European war, and every time the European leaders say, no, no, we're not going to have any peace negotiations, there won't be any concessions, every statement will go into the record of this narrative that the Europeans really, really want to continue this war. America wants to get out of this war. Hence, when America, if they can't make a peace, Trump will most likely say, well, we did our best, but the Europeans want war. Well, they can continue the war on their own. And this is the direction we're moving. And I don't think, I think the Europeans at this moment are just patting themselves on the back too much, how much they're standing up for Ukraine and how principled they are and all their values, to the extent they don't realize what actually is happening. And this is a failed war, a lost war with huge consequences is being dumped by the Americans, who you correctly said instigated this war, and it's being dropped on the Europeans now. So this is a disaster in the making.
Hmm. Voices like General Harald Kujat. I mean, I saw a couple of interviews with him. I mean, he's mercilessly attacked. Yeah, coming back to, I mean, this is a nice segue into propaganda. I mean, he tries his best to, I don't know, educate the German population. But if you see the attitude of the interviewers, it's just incredible. It's just not getting in. So I don't understand why the Europeans. Let me think this through. Why the Europeans, which is basically the Germans and the French mostly, the British, not to forget the British, of course, yeah, historically, but now they're so bent on taking over the war from the US and going into war with Russia, not knowing that, I mean, Russia was attacked 3 times through Ukraine, right? So this is a massive thing that the Western population, we here in Europe, are completely oblivious on. It's not possible to talk to people here about having a sensible conversation about Russia, about the interests of Russia, which you already said a while ago. And you and Bill Burns, former ambassador to Russia, now Is he still, by the way, is he still CIA? What happened to him after with the new administration? Do you know? Bill Burns, CIA
Uh,
director?
no, I'm not. Well, he's not the CI director, but I'm not sure what position he has landed in. He's a
However,
very good.
He was the CIA director
Yeah.
under Biden, but now I don't know what
Yeah.
he's. Yeah,
Yeah, because in the past, in 2008, when he warned that this war would start if we try to pull Ukraine into NATO, that it would first trigger a civil war, and then Russia would, in his words, reluctantly intervene on the side of Donbass. So he predicted this already in 2008. So I hope he has. He's become very hawkish now, though, but nonetheless, yeah, very aggressive against Russia, which kind of contradicts his previous statements. But yeah, that being said, he's good at his job, though. I guess he's a good diplomat, so he's got a lot of skills and experience. So I'm hoping the Trump administration will use him, but I also hope that he will. Yeah, readjust away from the hawkish stance he had during the Biden administration and adjust more to the realities, which I think is much more sensible under Trump. But and it sounds weird to say, especially in Europe. Again, you're not allowed to say anything positive about Trump either, but at least he's trying to bring this war to an end, and for me, that's at least something.
yeah, it's really incredible. I have his autobiography behind me where he said, for Russia, Ukraine is the, and not only for Putin, but for his whole elite, for his whole inner circle, Ukraine is the reddest of red line. So from Bill Burns to, make a U-turn from his original line of argumentation when he was, let's say, a real politician to CIA director was just astonishing.
Yeah, but you saw this. You saw ahead of the 2008 warnings when sorry, offering future membership to Ukraine in NATO. You saw from WikiLeaks. You saw the German ambassador. You saw the French ambassador. They all were worried that this would trigger a civil war. I think Merkel at one point around this time said that offering it, that is a membership action plan, would be interpreted as a declaration of war. Uh, you had you had a lot of this political leadership recognized, even on the American sides. You had Robert Gates, also former CIA director, Condoleezza Rice. I think a lot of these people recognized that this could end in disaster, and it was nonetheless pushed. And so I think it's worth bringing this up because, as you said, now if you try to suggest that this somehow wasn't unprovoked, it's immediately you get under various a lot of attacks. You have to pay a very high social cost. You should fear for your job. I mean, there's a lot of cost if you want to point out. So, but this is why it's important to focus on some of these undisputable facts. Uh, Yet, the discourse is just god awful, and this idea that it's still, for me, the most dangerous narrative of all is this was unprovoked. Uh, and if you challenge it, it's immediately attacked as argued to try to legitimize the war. I argue quite different. I say it's important to be honest about why this war began, because this is one of the most provoked wars I have ever seen. And if you rob the public of this recognition, then if you just say that this was Russian expansionism, then this legitimizes the idea that we can't find a compromise because then we reward this expansionism. And again, if Putin is really Hitler, then we can't, any negotiation would be appeasement. So we have to really stand up now. This is why all our political leaders, they can't, whenever they address this topic, they can't get through the first sentence without bringing up Hitler. It's a really, the discourse is just, for lack of better word, dumb. And it's so dangerous as well because this is the main argument from the Europeans. We can't make any compromise. We can't even talk to the Russians because they're Hitler. This is the ridiculous mentality, the geopolitical immaturity which they have descended into. So it's incredible important, which is why I also often bring out the main point that after the coup, which you mentioned, the Americans were very openly behind. You even have the New York Times and Washington Post confirming that on the next day or the second day after the coup, the American intelligence, well, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, but installed by the American, he immediately contacted CIA and MI6 to have this partnership against the Russians, and this culminated into 12 CIA secret bases along the Russian border. where they did, it went across the border into Russia, began in this industrial spying and theft of equipment. This is how it began, and this again, when the Ukrainian intelligence services went were well, what the Americans said in New York Times and Washington Post was it had to be rebuilt from scratch. The Americans came in, they had to essentially slaughter what was there and build something up, something new. And the question is why? Well, because 2, 3 days later, the entire intelligence agencies of Ukraine, they were Russia was their greatest friend and ally. The vast majority of Ukrainians considered partnership with Russia to be most important. So over only 2, 3 days, it went from being friends with Russia and had to then become a weapon against Russia. So the Americans came in, and again, on the first or second day, they already began the process of rebuilding or building the intelligence services from scratch against the Russians. So they were building these intelligence services as mercenaries, then effectively against the Russians. All this top American media has confirmed this. All the details have come out. So why are we still saying that this was somehow an unprovoked war? This is why the Russians took Crimea. Keep in mind, all of this happened before Crimea. Again, on a Monday, Ukraine is the best friend of Russia. On a Wednesday, suddenly now the intelligence services will be used as a weapon against the Russians. So how does this conform with their narrative that this was unprovoked? Of course, that's when the Russians went in and took Crimea, and you had an uprising in Donbass, just like William Burns had suggested. So these people who argue that all of this is just, Putin verster or propaganda, it's worth noting that they say this with as if they have some morality behind them. But what they're doing is they're making it impossible to have any diplomacy. These are the people who are pushing for a long war. These are the people who are effectively making it impossible for European politicians to sit down and talk to the Russians. These are the ones who made it possible that we watched hundreds of thousands of young men die on the battlefield while our ridiculous politicians refused to even sit down with the Russians to see if some of this could be even mitigated.
Mm.
This is a disaster. So these people who are trying to dismiss everything as being Russian propaganda, ignoring reality, these people are swimming in blood. This is just the most disgusting thing you can imagine. And yet they walk around as if they have some immense moral high ground. It's completely absurd. It's war propaganda. That's all it is.
Yeah, I think I have to give Trump and his administration at least one bonus points. At least they started talk to the Russians again. Imagine Biden administration stopped talking on a diplomatic level to Russia. I mean, this is just incredible. Lavrov says yesterday, and I quote, normalcy has returned, or something like it seems normalcy has returned to the U.S. government, and that's true. Very briefly, because I don't want to spend the whole time on that specific topic, but how feasible is it that, from your perspective, that Russia can agree to this 30-day, let's call it ceasefire, whilst they are winning? I mean, they are making I mean, it's already good that finally it's open. Yeah, everybody says this Ukraine can no longer win this. Even the Americans said it already, right? Bush, sorry, Trump in his televised exchange with Zelensky, where he said, "You are gambling with World War III," you know. So, how likely is it that, and again, I'm still looking at the news ticker here, there's nothing coming out of Russia in terms of if they would accept the peace deal, whilst indicating, like Lavrov, manage expectations. Yeah. So from your perspective, can they accept this 30-day peace deal, accepting the fact that Ukraine probably will regroup, more armaments come in from all kinds of countries? It wouldn't serve any interests, any Russian interests to have this peace deal now.
Yeah, and this is a great contradiction because the Ukrainians were willing to accept negotiations and the ceasefire. U.S. rewarded them by continue supplying weapons. So yeah, of course you have to have a reward for being willing to return to the negotiation table. But that being said, what you're now saying is yes, okay, now we're going to have a ceasefire. Yet America and Europe is going to use this pause, a 30-day pause, to pump weapons into Ukraine. this is a very, yes, a very strange reward. So no, it's very deeply problematic, and it has to be noted that the greatest concern for the Russians is that is that this will be another Minsk agreement. That is, it's a ceasefire without a political settlement. So the Ukrainians, that when I say Ukrainians, they actually want peace. The majority of them, they want to, they're even willing to cede territory. So correctly, Zelensky and the European leaders, they're the ones who are still none, and they're not accepting any of these key foundations of the of a political settlement. So it begs the question what the ceasefire is intended to achieve. And so far it has a lot of risks. It again the it's a pause to pump weapons in to try to change the tide of the war. It's also, from if you listen to Starmer, it sounds as if he wants to use this to send in troops, European troops on the ground, which would be a tripwire in case, or not in case, when most definitely the ceasefire would break down. Because if there is no political settlement, then the war will restart, because this war did not happen out of nothing. There's reasons behind this, and Russians have very clear objectives. They don't want any NATO troops in Ukraine. They see this as an existential threat. So you can't. This has to be addressed now. I don't want to be too dismissive of what was done by the Americans. Indeed, yesterday I had a chat with yeah, Chas Freeman, who's a very high-ranking American diplomat, and he was more optimistic. He looked at this as if being a tactic only from the Americans, because the Europeans refused to talk about peace or anything. The Ukrainians also were quite reluctant, or again, Zelensky was reluctant. So this was a way of effectively making all of them embrace the idea of negotiating again. So they got them to the negotiation table. Um, but my yeah, so this could be yeah, this could be an inroad to more extensive negotiations. But on the other hand, this one phrase from Marco Rubio I found very concerning, which is, now the ball is now in Russia's court. This makes it sound as if, okay, here's the deal, ceasefire, take it or leave it. And the reason why the Europeans and Zelensky was so eager, well, we saw it in the media right after. Okay, here's the ceasefire deal. If Russia doesn't take it, we must bring immense pain on Russia, pressure. So this is simply seen as a way of winning the Americans over from now trying to get peace to getting them back on Team Zelensky and the European warmongers who wants to restart this war and get America's full commitment to effectively continue the Biden policies of continuous escalation. So I think it's this is my concern. But of course, if the Americans simply say, okay, now we at least have Zelensky at the negotiation table, here we have this offer of a 30-day ceasefire, let's take it to the Russians. This is our starting point in negotiations. And then the Russians will say, well, where's the political settlement? How do we know you're not going to rearm? Will the Europeans enter the battlefield? What exactly is in it for us? Because the Ukrainian front line just collapsed in Kursk. They're being chased out now. This
Exactly.
is the time to have a ceasefire? So no. So if this is the opening, starting of talking to the Russians, is one thing. If it's what Rubio said, take it or leave it, and then we might have some huge problems. But I also don't want to dismiss altogether that the Russians won't want to embrace, because if this is a possibility that this could lead to a peace, I think the Russians have suffered greatly in this war as well. They want this war to come to an end. They just don't want to to simply this being something that prolongs it even further.
I had Ambassador Just Freeman on a couple of times. He's a very lucid voice on multiple areas, and I was actually surprised how in depth his knowledge was, even on technical terms. Internet, cyber security, etc. It's incredible to see with
Oh, he's a
80,
real treasure. They should.
80
I try to
84, I
speak with him
believe.
as often as possible. So yeah.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Glenn, if we switch over to propaganda. Now, you wrote a couple of books about propaganda, and we will discuss them. To enter this discussion, first of all, if we think about propaganda, we think about Nazi, Goebbels, etc. Not knowing, most of people not knowing that Goebbels actually learned his trade, learned propaganda from America, from Sigmund Freud's nephew Edward Bernays, right? But we in the West, we always think, okay, we cannot trust anything in Russian media. RT is, I don't know, you're in Norway, in Sweden? Norway?
Norway, yeah.
Norway. In the Netherlands, you cannot get RT anymore. It's blocked.
Yeah.
So Sputnik, RT, any kind of Russian media is blocked because it's so-called state propaganda. This is kind of hardwired in our brain. And of course, honestly, it's true to a large extent. But on the reverse side, that assumes that our media here in the West is kind of transparent and unbiased. And this is an absolute massive misconception. Me as behavior analyst, I'm extremely interested in media propaganda manipulation, biases, etc. I did a couple of pieces on this already. And now I found that you wrote at least through 3 books about it. The first one is Russophobia, Propaganda in International Politics. I would like to come back to this. The second one is the think tank racket. And then you have the Ukrainian war and Eurasian World Order 2024. If we start with the first one, Russophobia, propaganda in international politics, you argue that the West has constructed an anti-Russian narrative that serves as a tool for ideological and geopolitical confrontation. And that Russophobia is a mechanism for maintaining Western unity, influencing public perception, and justifying policies against Russia. I mean, that's spot on. I would be interested from you to see what specific methodologies are being used here.
Well, like yeah, sure. Let me just say very quickly that you're very correct that we think this is something that only Nazi Germany did with. But indeed, it's worth noting that a little bit more than a century ago, when a lot of this original literature and ideas on propaganda first came out, which Edward Bernays, based on the group psychology ideas of his uncle Sigmund Freud, they realized that the word propaganda itself had been soiled essentially. It's been by Germany because everyone associated with something evil. Before then, it was common to refer to this as a normal occupation, that is propaganda. But so they had to. Bernays said we have to come up with a new name. Propaganda can be what our opponents do. We have to call it something else for us, because otherwise we sound like bad guys. So they renamed it to public relations. So propaganda is what our adversaries do. Public relations is what we do. And this part of propaganda as well. You disconnect the language. So one word for them and one for us. You know, we have governments, they have regimes, they have invasions, we have humanitarian interventions. This is how language is supposed to work. The second is what you also said, with the assumption that we don't do the propaganda because we have democracies. This is also something that the original literature were very clear, from Lippmann to Bernays. They said this is not the case. If anything, democracies are more dependent on propaganda, because democracies, when sovereignty is transferred from to the people. So if you have, then it's even more need to lead the public, and if you're going to lead the public, then yeah, you need more propaganda. It wouldn't be the same necessary. It wouldn't be as necessary if you simply could rule without the approval of the public. And lastly, if you have a very system based on hardwired ideology, it's also more likely to be propagandistic. And if you look in the West, how everything is organized around liberalism, this provides a very strong foundation, because propaganda tends to divide into stereotypes. That is, good versus evil, superior versus inferior. So any ideologies assist in this. So this is why whenever any politician, journalist talks about any conflict anywhere in the world, it's always about liberal democracy versus some kind of authoritarianism or terrorism. So it's always this good versus evil. This is, and ideology provides fuel for this. Um, Now, my methodology, now I have to, yeah, think about the book. It came out in 2021. But um,
Make it more general. You don't need to focus on the book.
yeah, okay. Well, essentially, I look at, I try to unpack the concept of uh, of what propaganda actually is, and then creating the, yeah, clear indicators to see what we would expect from a propagandistic society. Now, the main problem is that the propaganda, considering how often we use this word, it's very diffuse, it's very unclear, it's not conceptualized often, and we tend to dismiss it as whatever our opponents say. Like you said, any Russian media now is propaganda, which is a good way of justifying mass censorship. If you say something that's might try to understand the Russians, we say propaganda, because now we have to impose some social cost on you. But this is not what propaganda is. It's often portrayed as being lies or misinformation, but this is not correct because this assumes that you're trying to trick people by appealing to reason and then fool them. But propaganda is based on the irrational because human beings aren't only rational individuals. We also have a lot of instincts. And one of the strongest one is our tendency to organize in groups. So we're very much influenced by the people around us. We adjust to adjust to the group, and this is why when you said Bernays, he based it on the theories of his uncle Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud introduced this idea of group psychology. That is these instincts by the individual to adjust to the group. This overrides all rational assessments and reflections by the individual. So, what are the main instincts? The group psychology, which Bernays found out you can use to manipulate the public to steer them in the right direction, like sheep. Well, you have to define our group and opponent group. So who are we? This is very built into human nature. We organize in groups for meaning, security, and if you can define this group, who we are and who the other are, then reality doesn't really matter much. Because if you can define the in group as good or liberal democratic, our out groups are always evil authoritarian. Suddenly, reality doesn't matter because if we invade a country, it's always because we want to spread freedom, democracy, and human rights. If our opponents do exactly the same, it's for empire, yeah, just being evil effectively. So assigning the stereotypes is a very key feature of any propaganda. So that was the point of departure in this assessment. And then you can, of course, explore how narratives are constructed, how the language is manipulated. This is something Orwell was very deep into as well, because our language today is becoming absurd. We're robbing it of all meaning. As I mentioned, we don't have the same words for what we do and they do. So we say the Russians, they have spheres of influence. The EU have, ring of friendly states. And it's the main idea is we shouldn't be able to compare anymore. And it's very, very dangerous. So no, the topic is quite vast, and just to finish off, the main idea, because propaganda, it doesn't appeal to reason, it appeals to the irrational aspect of human beings. It should be countered by reason. So if you want counter propaganda, appeal to the rationality of the individual. If you think that the Russians are doing propaganda, wonderful. Okay, let's get a NATO Secretary General or the American president and they get the Russian president, have them do a discussion. You can do it over Zoom if you will. Have a debate and openly discuss the issues. This is how you appeal to reason. This is how you avoid these group instincts and the tactics of overcoming reason. But we don't. We don't even want to hear it. When we use propaganda, we say we shut down all information. And there can be no more dissent. There can be no more discussion. So this is a very propagandistic way of abusing the whole idea of propaganda. So no, it's absolute ridiculous what is happening, and I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. At least I'm only 45, but nonetheless, I have never seen anything like this. This incredible propaganda over the past few years, and it really began intensified from 2016 when the Americans panicked that Trump, or well, not the Americans, but the political elites in Europe and America panicked that Trump won, and we started this RussiaGate hoax.
You are referring to in-group, out-group bias, which is a cognitive bias. And there is a fabulous website from the Harvard University, implicit association tests. They have a string of association tests, also tests that test your bias, your cognitive bias. I call them internalized programs. They're coming from evolutionary psychology. We are hardwired, and you can do this. I think they have 20 different tests. Yeah, but you can repeat those tests, and the results will be the same, even though you know how it works. because it comes from an subcon, it works on the subconscious level. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is again because this is how human beings organize when it's in groups. And what is important is we organize it in group who are us, in us, and who are them, the other, as you say, the out group. And what is interesting is it used to belong to sociology. This is where theories about human beings work. But with the new neuro sciences, they actually measure it in the brain that when human beings meet someone, we organize them in in-group, out-group immediately within the fraction of a second. And then we once we made our decision or we see what our group is doing and then we adjust to this, uh, then suddenly we begin to rationalize it. So a lot of the decisions and our opinions are instincts. And once the instinct have already arrived on a conclusion or decision, then as an individual we have to rationalize it to to convince ourselves that we're only rational beings. But as Freud and many of other psychologists point out, is the scope of our reasoning and rationality is quite limited. Quite often, this is all we do. We act on instincts and then we rationalize it afterwards.
Hmm. I interviewed the CEO of a German PR company who focuses on evolutionary psychology to guide consumer behavior. I put the link in the description because that's what politicians do. They're using our instincts. I'm hesitating to use that term. They're exploiting cognitive biases, mental shortcuts that are hardwired in our system. So from a business perspective, PR, another word for propaganda, from a commercial perspective, but you can apply the same thing, and this is done by any spin doctors around here on the political level. One of those institutions who is using that are think tanks, which brings me to your second book, The Think Tank Racket. Maybe first you explain what this book is about, and then scrape on the propaganda machines.
Well, think tanks.
It's a
Well,
euphemism, think tank, right?
yeah. Oh yeah, no, you put that on the cover as well. No, well, uh, the think tanks are interesting because I argue that again you don't want to be everything shouldn't be too black and white. So I don't want to be too dismissive because I thought initially they served an important purpose. That is that they function as more of a bridge between academia and politicians. As academics, we often look at very narrow issues and discuss the methods and the concepts. And again, it becomes very if you read the journal articles, it's very difficult to read for people who are not in that academic field. So often, what the decision makers want, let's say you're politicians, you need to know everything from Brazilian agriculture to economic challenges in Bolivia and the ethnic fighting in in Tanzania. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Our politicians aren't that bright. No one is that bright. You can't know everything about everything, so you need to have outside expert opinion. And academics might often be too narrow in their focus. So what you want is information briefings, yeah, ideally with some recommendations. And in these days, we see that the think tanks also lean more towards ideology. That is, which ideological position should we hold? And so the think tanks, this is the main role the think tanks had. They're a bridge between academia and decision makers. However, who gets to whisper into the ear of those who rule, it can be a very powerful a source of power. I mean, does it really matter who you vote for if you can control the people who deliver them information? So the think tanks then gain more power, and once you have power, someone will want to have influence. So who now would be the main funder of these think tanks? Well, overwhelmingly so, it's the arms industry. So they pump a lot of weapons into this. And the think tanks now, they not only provide information for congressional hearings, they inform presidential administrations. Indeed, the people themselves in office in America, most of them now seem to belong to think tanks. So when they're out of office, they join these think tanks to remain relevant. When they go back into administration, they still keep their affiliation with this think tank. So it becomes a very powerful network building. Furthermore, in the media, they're also taking more and more space. That is, they provide the expert opinion in the media. But what does it mean when our politicians, the people who inform the politicians, and also the people who mobilize public support through the media, they're all financed by think tanks who are overwhelmingly financed by the arms industry. Well, you end up in a situation where where the interests are skewed towards war, and this is and the military solution. So this is a huge problem because the think tanks follow you can consider it a very market fundamentalist idea that even foreign policy is now for sale, the media is for sale, all of this is for sale, and a key instrument towards this are the think tanks. So it doesn't mean that we have to scrap and throw away all think tanks, throw away the baby with the bathwater, but there is necessary to have some critical debate around the think tanks. And the great irony is a lot of the best research and criticism against the think tanks comes from think tanks, such as the Queen's Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and also I think it's the Kennan Institute, who had also done some work on this, showing how think tanks are corrupting politics and the media. So again, I don't want to be too yeah throw everyone under the bus. I'm just saying one has to be open about these things, much like NGOs, by the way. These are huge problems which we should be addressing in an honest way.
I interviewed Trita Parsi from the Queen's Institute like 2, 3 weeks ago. Yeah, a really, really interesting discussion about Iran. Yeah. Now, there is another one very briefly, the Ukraine war and the Eurasian world order. How media from both West and Russia engage in strategic messaging.
Sorry, I missed the last part there.
So there's a third book that you
Yeah.
wrote. It's called The Ukrainian War and the Eurasian World
Oh
Order.
yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And there you discuss how media from both West and Russia engage in strategic messaging.
Uh, yes. Well, uh, yeah.
Maybe
Sorry. You want?
maybe you define strategic messaging.
Oh well, it also falls within the within the propaganda. There is often it's narratives they want to build, and narratives can be very powerful. That is, they lead public to reach the conclusion you want. If you would just tell them what they should think, it's not necessarily possible. But if you can create the narratives, you lead them down the road you want them. So for example, in the Ukraine war, so we began talking. A key theme was we wanted a long war. This is something that Zelensky also actually pointed out in March of 2022 in an interview with The Economist, that a lot of the countries in the West want a long war, even if it means the destruction of Ukraine, because by having a long war they could weaken Russia. This was, again, Zelensky's own words. And so how do you push for a long war? It's not easy to always sell war. And the strategic narratives often are based around this. You have to sell it as being virtuous. So how do you sell war as virtuous? Well, that's if peace is a betrayal. So and that's why the unprovoked narrative was very important, because once that's at the front and center, now sending weapons, refusing negotiations and peace. This is how you confront your opponents. So also casualty numbers. If you say the Ukrainians are taking huge casualties, for a normal person, you could interpret that as being, well, you have empathy for what they're going through. But no, this is considered to be pro-Kremlin talking points. I've been told that I'm parroting Kremlin, because if you say they have high casualties, that means now you're undermining support for the war. So what you want to say is Russia takes high casualties, and it's the Ukrainians have low. And now the public is more eager to continue supporting the war. I've been quite horrified by what I've seen as being since 2014 the attack on Ukrainian civil society. So again, language rights, purging of political opposition, the Orthodox Church, the cultural rights, language rights across the board. And of course, now watching all these young men being dragged off the streets.
Virtually dragged out
Yeah,
of
virtually
cars with
dragged. Yeah, and I see, in Ukraine, you have, mothers, wives, all protesting once their sons and their husbands back. we don't put them in the media in our countries because we consider this also to be supporting Russia's narrative. Because if the war isn't popular in Ukraine, well, God forbid, some of the public in the West might be less war enthusiastic. They would not want to continue the war. So, in order to be pro-Ukrainian, we don't show the suffering of Ukrainians, what Zelensky has done. So it's everything has to be organized around this, and this is how we end up in this absurd situation that if you and I discuss, the kidnapping of all these Ukrainian men had not allowed to leave the country, the horrible the way a huge part of the population become now second-rate citizens. We can't discuss this because this is now pro-Russian as well. So this is all the narratives. This is the messaging we're doing, and it's very it's very it's awful because all of this is meant to make war sound virtuous and peace be treasonous, which is why, by the way, every time NATO goes to war against someone, they're always the new Hitler. It can be Milosevic,
Gaddafi,
Gaddafi, Hussein, Putin,
Assad. Yeah.
Assad. Yeah, everyone is a Hitler because
We have an
once you evoke
inflation of Hitlers. Yeah, yeah.
it is, yeah, and it's a cheap. Once you play the Hitler card, you usually know that there's some very dumb arguments coming, that they don't have any rational arguments, but they're appealing to something else. They're saying again, when you're with Hitler, we don't accept any dissent. Everyone has to condemn, and
They
there's
aim at emotions because
yeah,
emotions rule. We make our decisions based on emotions and then we rationalize them. Yeah,
exactly, and emotions run high when these topics are brought up.
very high. Very high.
Yeah.
Glenn, you just scratched on the topic of casualties. Now, I heard Colonel McGregor yesterday saying that Ukraine lost 1.2 million men, lost as in dead, not including the wounded. Is that anything that sounds reasonable to you?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't have
Yeah,
any reliable numbers on casualties. I know that it's the numbers are manipulated very heavily. Sometimes, of course, the numbers are absurd. I think at one point Zelensky said, "Oh no, we have 30,000 dead, but
yeah.
also we need to replace our losses by recruiting another 500,000 men." So it's
Exactly. It
but
makes no sense at all.
well, we passed common sense a very, very long
Yeah,
time ago. Look at what our rhetoric is. Again, if you want to if you want to hate the enemy, you have to make him look weak and useless, and also he has to be an overwhelming threat. This is also something that NATO always does. That is, the Russians are hopelessly backwards. They can't even take simple Ukrainian villages. They're fighting with shovels. They're stealing chips from washing machines,
yeah.
but also at the same time, they're overwhelmingly powerful. They can invade the Baltic countries, Poland. They may
All
march
of
on
Europe,
Paris.
oh,
Yeah,
they
all
come
the
to all of us, They will
yeah,
invade Sweden, Finland, Poland, everybody. The Russians are coming.
yeah, they're coming. They're coming. This is the idea. But also, the reason why we really, really need to have Ukraine into NATO, we've been told, is because Russia would never dare to attack a NATO country. However, we're also told that we have to stop Putin, because we don't talk about Russia anymore. We personalized it into Putin, which is now the devil. Putin, after he takes Ukraine, he will also then start to attack NATO. So Ukraine has to be in NATO because he won't attack NATO, but also once he's finished with Ukraine, he will attack NATO. I mean,
Yeah,
this is the nonsense.
yeah,
But this is what I find fascinating because we created a consensus, not just in this country, but across Europe. But the consensus is very difficult to challenge because we're told, well, now you're an outlier, you're some crazy voice. But the consensus is all based on nonsense. All the key facts of the war is being left out. I now looked at the collapse of Kursk. It's almost every time there's a fact which is inconvenient, it's just gone. Nord Stream, oh, Russia attacks its own pipelines, as if this is we have a consensus, as if this made any sense. Even after the Americans admit, okay, the Russians didn't do this, um, and effectively NATO and the US have been caught lying because they did lie in the beginning. They said that this all most likely this was Russia. All evidence points towards Russia, and then suddenly now we're told that, oh no, the Americans knew about the attack before it actually happened. They claimed that they tried to stop it. The Russians had nothing to do with it. But are we going to discuss the fact that our own political leaders lied to us to escalate the Ukraine war? No, we don't talk about it at all. but we still have for some reason, a consensus that most likely it was Russia. Most likely Russia attacks a nuclear power plant which it controls. Never any of the ones under Ukraine control, but only its own nuclear power plant Russia attacks. It's so beyond absurd, but if you challenge it, these people who keep pushing it. There's no pushback. There's no challenge. So they have created the narrative, which there seemingly is a consensus around. And if you put a question to it, then you're some kind of a lunatic. And I thought because in this country, in Norway, I try to challenge some of these narratives sometimes. And what is fascinating is if you do, they have some ridiculous conspiracy theory expert who's he's done nothing at all like this. It's just a nobody who calls everyone the state doesn't like conspiracy theorists, and they cite them. Oh well, obviously Diesen is a conspiracy theorist, and meanwhile I speak with the former CI director of Russian analysis, and he says, "Oh no, your analysis is very spot on." Do they cite the former CI director of Russian analysis, or do they cite some Yahoo who claims to be a expert on everything, that he can reveal any conspiracy theories? No, our media and our goes with the crazy people, the ones, yeah, who know nothing. It's so pathetic and sad how our because it's not just demonizing Russia. We're also destroying key foundations of our own society. We're becoming pathetic, ridiculous, and it's just and dangerous at the same time.
And the media plays a major role. And the reason why I reached out to you again is because I saw an interview with you on Al Jazeera. And I was really surprised. I mean, I know the stance of Al Jazeera when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's no surprise there. But for when they talk about Ukraine and Russia, they are as, how shall I say this, manipulative as any Western media. The interviewer was, so virtually, I think I counted 3 times he cut you off. I mean, incredible.
Yeah, the first question, I was able to get 2 seconds into it before he cut me off, and also even at the end, I remember he asked,
Mhm.
well, how I was going to go, and I said, well, the Ukrainian army is now collapsing. The collapse have already begun and it's intensifying. And it's like, well, that's not really correct. We see that the borders haven't changed that much, and we're out of time.
Yeah.
And it was almost comedy. Like
Yeah.
if I would be allowed to respond, I would have said, well, this is a war of attrition. In a war of attrition, you have to look at attrition rates. How many are you losing compared to your opponents? And you see that the Ukrainian losses are intensifying. They have a huge shortage in manpower. They have a shortage in equipment. Across all the metrics, things are going bad. The economy doesn't work anymore. So everything, and you see that as a result, once the manpower is gone, then in a war of attrition, you begin to take the territories. And now you see the territories falling faster and faster. The cities the Russians are taking don't have to be bombed out anymore to the same extent. They're able to take them easier. I can explain the metrics, how you would measure a collapse in a war of attrition, but you're not, but they just cut you off going, no, I have decided that this is not the case. And no, yeah, that was a very strange, because Al Jazeera is often very good on other things, but this was a very weird,
Yeah.
very weird interview.
Yeah. Glenn, we have a couple of minutes left, and there's one last thing that I would like to run by you, because propaganda cuts 2 ways. There's the information that you propagate and manipulate, and there's the information that you suppress. And if I may say so, my own Twitter account has been permanently suspended as of last Monday. So that's one way of suppressing information. Anything that you can share on the topic of suppressing information as a means of manipulation?
Um, no, propaganda is quite yeah, well, it's a suppression of information. It can go through many things. Sometimes you have censorship. You can, with the new digital media, you can, of course, fix the algorithms. Um, but we,
Okay,
what we,
we know
but we,
that's what you can do. We know all that. But do you have specific examples in your research?
on suppression of well, there's many ways you can go about it. So often it's yeah, it's how it's done. It has to be seen as legitimate. But in the United States, for example, they've gone through with these platforms. You have governments who work with the tech companies because they're not supposed to do censorship. But as we learned from Mark Zuckerberg, the Biden administration approached him. They say, okay, we don't want this, this, this. So the Ukrainian government handed a list over who they consider to be propaganda, which are people who undermine the Ukrainian war narrative. That is now propaganda. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. And they handed over to the US government, to its intelligence agencies. Then the Biden administration went to the social media companies, and as Mark Zuckerberg also said, they were forced or asked to censor the information which they knew were correct. They removed a lot of people from various platforms, but also you can use NGOs as well. This is a very interesting approach. This is something also I have a problem with, which is especially from the 1980s, the Americans began to pump a lot of money into this, and they call them non-governmental organizations, but they're staffed with people linked to the intelligence communities. They're 100% funded by the U.S. government, and they tend to interpret everything as being whatever geopolitical interests are of the United States. We see that this is framed as human rights, and this is great propaganda, by the way, because now if you have a human rights organization, then everything is a struggle between human rights and democracy versus authoritarianism. So they walk around speaking as if they're some independent, non-governmental organization, even though they're completely funded by the government. And again, we know already that all the evidence is out that this was established by Reagan, CIA director, so they can interfere in the open. And anyways, my point is that they also operate within censorship. So I work in Norway. Every single time I'm invited to present anywhere. We have the same NGO financed by the Americans, National Endowment for Democracy, that counsels that tries to make them pull back my invitation. If I'm interviewed by the media, they're pressuring the media to apologize. They're posting pictures of my house on social media. They're
Wow.
trying to invoke threats from different digital online trolls. So. So yeah, this is state. Also, my own government, by the way, funds them. So this is yeah, state-funded harassment. Effectively, it's quite yeah, repulsive. So, but it's yeah, it's many ways you can try to put pressure and censor. By the way, I was also kicked off YouTube once, and I got an email that for repeated and extreme hate speech. And anyways, eventually, from some pressure from on them, yeah, they had to admit, oh yeah, well, there was no hate speech at all. But it wasn't possible. It's all automated. You don't actually get to talk to any people, and it's all you just yeah, removed from the internet. So
How long did it take you to be reinstated?
I think it took 2 weeks or something. But it was interesting because I criticized it, and then I noticed that Glenn Greenwald retweeted it, like why is Glenn Diesen removed, and it had like 500,000 views. And then David Sachs, he's now the AI czar of the Trump administration. He also leaned in and saying, this is, why did they censor Glenn Diesen? And, so he also leaned in. And then my book was on the Jeffrey Sachs book club, and he also said, I will find out what has happened here because, so I'm not sure what happened, but somehow I went from having repeated severe hate speech, and I never I don't hate I don't hate anyone. I never had any hate speech, and then they had to come out later on saying, oh yeah, sorry about this. Even though I appealed, they rejected the appeal, and then later on they just said, oops, yeah, sorry, that was a mistake. No hate speech, and yeah, they reestablished the account with a few thousand subscribers missing, but nonetheless, it's it's very yeah, it's a bit creepy how how this works, especially when you know that they're working hand in hand with governments as well.
My last comment. Yeah, I did a piece on Google, Facebook, etc. Those owners of the internet. Now, in the case of Google, but the same is true for Facebook. In the case of Google, we have the impression those two guys, they were sitting and fiddling on a search engine. Nothing is further from the truth. From the very outset, they were funded by intelligence, by DARPA. The same is true for Facebook. People do not realize that the intelligence services are interwoven in those companies. So that makes it very difficult. I mean, shadow banning is a whole topic. So how to not to completely kill it, but to suppress distribution. Yeah. Anyway, I know that you have to run, Glenn. It was my pleasure talking to you again. I wish you all the best, and I promise you're gonna hear from me again.
Oh, I hope so. It's been great talking to you again.
Likewise. If you made it that far, congratulations! You are ahead of the pack. If this video resonated with you in any kind of form, don't just scroll away. Hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who really needs to see it, and most importantly, subscribe. It sounds like a small thing, and honestly, it probably is a small thing, but this is exactly how we can keep these conversations alive. And if you missed it at the beginning, my Twitter account has been permanently suspended. Not for spam, not for bots, but for being too critical, for questioning the wrong people and interests. And that's the game now. Step too far out of the lines and they erase you. So if you value independent voices, if you want to stay connected, Substack is the place to go. It's free, the link's right below, and I would really love to hear from you. Tell me how it's changing the way you see the world and its people. So thanks for watching, thanks for thinking, and remember, always look beyond the headlines.